The covenant of Abraham is possibly the most significant single event that shaped the entire Old Testament. The literal translation of Abraham is father of a multitude. Abraham accepted the call of God. Abraham was a man that went forward when God called him. It is actually a major trait of Abraham. He trusted God. He was called a friend of God. A friend of God. That is a respectable title. God made a promise to Abraham that Christians continue to rely on. God started creation with one man, and he started redemption with one man. God is said to have made a covenant with Abraham, a theme that continues through the Bible to Jesus, who institutes a new covenant commemorated at the Lord's Supper. It is critical to understand the meaning of the term covenant. Some people confuse it with the word contract, but it is not a deal made between two parties with equal power and authority. A covenant is made solely by one party in order to bless the other. The other party has only two options: accept or reject the terms. They are unchangeable. When God makes a covenant, he keeps it and swears to uphold it. Whereas a human might say, "By God, I promise to do that," God says, "By myself, I swear," because there is nothing above God to swear by. As a result, he swears by himself and tells the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. In Genesis 12, God repeats the words of intention, "I will," 6 times in his promise to Abraham, much like a husband marrying a bride. Genesis 12, 1-9. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abraham went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abraham traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there, he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abraham set out and continued toward the Negev. The truth is that the God of the universe married this particular family, and his first promise was to provide them with a home, a small patch of land where the continents meet, the very center of the world's landmass in Jerusalem. And that is where the roads from Africa to Asia and from Arabia to Europe cross, near a small hill called Armageddon in Hebrew, the world's crossroads. His second promise was to provide them with heirs. He stated that Abraham's descendants would always exist on the planet. And he said this despite the fact that both Abraham and Sarah were getting older. The third promise was that he would use them to bless or to curse every other nation. The calling of the Jews is to share God with everybody. It is a calling that can cut both ways. For God said to Abraham, "Those who curse you will be cursed. Those who bless you will be blessed." Genesis 15:1. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. "Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield, your very great reward." About 10 years had passed since Abraham first picked up and moved his family toward Canaan. Back then, God promised Abraham great blessing, his own land, and a multitude of children. But Abraham still had no kids, a fact that he felt compelled to point out to God. Genesis 15, 2-3. But Abraham said, "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?" And Abraham said, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir." God renewed his covenant with Abraham, insisting that his wealth would be inherited by someone who came from his own body. Abraham had agreed with his wife to have a son through another, but this was not accepted. He also added some specificity to the promise. Previously, he had simply stated that Abraham would become a great nation, but now he fleshed that out by pointing to the stars. "Count the stars if you can. That is the number of descendants you will have." Genesis 15, 4-5. Then the word of the Lord came to him. "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." God was aware of Abraham's feelings of being old and barren, but if God is capable of creating billions of stars from nothing, he is also capable of resurrecting an old man, and he has the power to resurrect you as well. Genesis 15, 6. Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Despite all the obstacles that lay ahead of him, Abraham believed God's promise as he gazed up at the night sky. God saw his faith and counted it as righteousness. In Romans 4:3, the Apostle Paul picks up on this verse, using Abraham as an example of how faith works. God spoke to Abraham, and Abraham believed him. That's the essence of faith. Romans 4:3. For what saith the Scripture? Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Because of this faith, God chose to count Abraham's faith as righteousness. That is the payoff of faith. Genesis 15, 7-8. He also said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, to give you this land to take possession of it." But Abraham said, "Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it?" Abraham believed, but still wanted more specifics about how all of this would come to pass. He inquired, "Lord God, how can I know that I will possess this land?" God then instructed Abraham to carry out what appeared to be a strange ritual. He instructed Abraham to acquire a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Genesis 15, 9-21. So the Lord said to him, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Abraham brought all of these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here. For the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Abraham did so and cut each animal in half. Then Abraham fell asleep. These strange details are important to what happened next. God renewed his covenant with Abraham, giving a few more specifics about the promised land and letting Abraham know about Israel's future exile in Egypt. The key detail, though, is that God alone, in the form of a smoking firepot and a flaming torch, passed through the path of the torn animals. Covenants like this one were supposed to involve two people. Both covenant parties were supposed to walk between the slain animals, signaling that if either broke their side of the bargain, he would suffer the same fate as the animals. So God's covenant was radically different. Abraham wasn't even awake when it was made, so he couldn't carry it out. God saw them through, promising to bear the fatal burden if either of them broke the covenant. Centuries later, after mountains of human sin had accumulated, the covenant penalty was borne by the Son of God on the cross of Calvary. God expected Abraham to obey God and do everything God told him to do, first by circumcising every male Jew as a sign that they were born into the covenant, and second by obeying God and doing everything God told him to do. This covenant is at the heart of the Bible, and it is the foundation upon which God said, "I will be your God and you will be my people," a phrase that is repeated until the very last page in Revelation. It indicates that God wishes to remain with us. At the very end of the Bible, God himself moves away from heaven and descends to earth to live with us forever on a new earth. God made a promise to Abraham that Christians continue to rely on. God started creation with one man, and he started redemption with one man. Genesis 21, 1-5. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Genesis 22, 1-2. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." By this point in the story, Isaac, the promised son, had grown into a young man. Abraham's dream had come true, but God suddenly appeared in this paradise and said, "Take your son and offer him as a burnt offering." According to the author, this was God's way of testing Abraham, and what a devastating test it was. This test was essentially a choice between God's blessing and God himself. Would Abraham obey God and respond in faith, even though God's new command was as perplexing, if not more so, than any command he had previously received? The command is fraught with obvious inconsistencies. God's command seemed to oppose God's promises. How could God command this? And how could such an action be explained to Sarah? Genesis 22:3. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. What would Abraham's reaction be? The answer is in that small clause. Abraham awoke early in the morning. God instructed Abraham to forego the one blessing in his life that he valued the most, a legitimate son. Abraham's immediate response was to obey. He didn't know how God would provide, but he knew that God would provide. So he avoided the forgeries of partial obedience and delayed obedience, both of which are actually disobedience, instead boldly following God into the unknown. Genesis 22:4-6. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife, as the two of them went on together. When Abraham and Isaac arrived at the mountain, Abraham told his servants, "The boy and I will go over there to worship, and then we'll come back to you." Abraham had the impression that he would be returning down the mountain with Isaac. The book of Hebrews explains what was going through his mind. Hebrews 11, 8-19. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed, and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore sprang there even of one, and him as good as dead, so many as the stars of the sky in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore innumerable. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country, and truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, an heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. By faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. Abraham was aware of God's promise that Isaac would carry on the line of blessing, but he was also aware that God had commanded him to sacrifice Isaac. The only conclusion he could reach was that God would raise him from the dead. Abraham's belief in resurrection appears strange, especially given that there have been no recorded instances of resurrection up to this point. But keep in mind that Abraham had already witnessed God's resurrection power. Genesis 22, 7-8. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When Isaac noticed the lack of an animal, the situation became awkward. Abraham responded by assuring Isaac that the lamb for the burnt offering would be provided by God himself. Abraham realized he was in a situation he couldn't fix. What he'd been asked to do seemed contradictory, but instead of trying to figure it out for himself, he decided to wait on God. As a result, when God places you in a contradiction with no obvious solution, you must rely on him alone to resolve it. Genesis 22, 9-12. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." When the time came, Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. Fortunately, the Lord's angel called out to him before he made the cut. Then this person said something strange. "Now I know you fear God," he said, "because you have not withheld your only son from me. God desires to sense our dedication." Genesis 22:13. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. At the same time that God stopped Abraham from sacrificing Isaac, Abraham looked up and saw a ram, not a sheep. Rams are stronger and more powerful than sheep. The ram was entangled by its horns in the thicket. God has a strange sense of timing. The ram had to have been there the whole time, but Abraham didn't notice it until God told him to. The solution to Abraham's problem had already been provided, but it was revealed only when Abraham took the step of obedience and faith. While Abraham was walking up one side of the mountain with his problem, God had arranged for his answer to come up the other side. Please keep in mind, however, that God did not reveal the answer until all of the conditions for obedience were met. Genesis 22:14. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Abraham appropriately named the location Yahweh Yireh, which means the Lord will provide. Abraham had previously believed that God was a provider, but this event changed that head knowledge into heart knowledge. Genesis 22:15-19. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Abraham could have walked back down the mountain and declared victory, but God wasn't finished. He reappeared, repeating and expanding on his promise to Abraham. "I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." This covenant is at the very heart of the Bible and is the basis upon which God said, "I will be your God, and you will be my people," a phrase which is repeated all the way through the Bible until the very last page in Revelation. It tells us that God wants to stick with us. At the very end of the Bible, God himself moves out of heaven and comes down to earth to live with us on a new earth forever.